Okay, so ready to dive deep. Today, we're tackling a pretty massive question, really. It's about the connection between, well, everything: matter, life, and information.
Yeah, it's a big one.
But lucky for us, we've got this amazing book to guide us from matter to life: Information and Causality. Think of it as like a cheat sheet to some of the most mind-blowing ideas out there about what life actually is.
And where it came from, right? I mean, that's the ultimate mystery.
Exactly. So the book, it basically brings together all these different perspectives from philosophers to physicists, even social scientists.
A real interdisciplinary kind of thing.
Totally. And the idea that keeps popping up is that information might be the key. Like, it's not just a way we describe life, it might actually be what life is built on.
Yeah, it's like, whoa, hold on. Are we saying that the universe is basically like a giant computer program?
Kind of. The book talks about this idea from John Archibald Wheeler, It from Bit. Basically, imagine the universe is fundamentally made of, well, information, not stuff, but choices.
Choices.
Yeah, like bits, zeros and ones, the most basic unit of information.
So instead of atoms and quarks, we've got bits.
It's more like the bits are what give rise to all the stuff we see. It's a huge shift in perspective.
And the funny thing is, this abstract idea, it's already woven into our lives. We buy and sell information
Yeah.
every day.
Right.
Like it's a commodity.
Right. And in biology, you can't escape it. DNA, that's basically a code, a set of instructions.
Mhm.
The whole field is trying to understand how information flows in living things.
Storage, transmission, all that jazz. It's fascinating, but it also gets super complex.
And here's where it gets even wilder. It's not enough for information to just sit there. It has to do something, right? Like cause stuff to happen.
Causation. That old chestnut.
The book dives into this connection between information and causation. They say that both of these things depend on something called counterfactuals.
Sounds like a mouthful.
It's actually pretty simple. Like, think of a light switch. It's on, right? But it could have been off. That's the counterfactual, the alternative.
Okay, I see. So like it implies a choice was made.
Exactly. And both information and causation depend on this idea that things could have been different.
So it's not just that something happened, but that something else could have happened instead. That makes sense.
Which brings us to constructor theory, which the book introduces as a whole new way of thinking about science with information at the center.
Constructor theory, huh? What's the gist?
Well, it's kind of trying to figure out what's possible in the universe, not just what exists now, but what's actually allowed to happen.
So like the limits of reality based on the laws of physics.
Yeah. And when you apply that to life, it gets really interesting. The book asks, what do the laws of physics need to be like for things like self-replication, even adaptation, to happen without, like, a blueprint?
So not like a divine watchmaker situation, right?
Exactly. How does life emerge from laws that don't have make life written into them?
A real head scratcher.
Totally. And the book talks about this researcher, Chiara Marletto, who's exploring this whole thing using constructor theory. Like, how does accurate self-reproduction, which is basically what life is, how does that happen under these no design laws?
So like the bare minimum requirements for life to just boot up.
That's the idea. And it's all about this idea that certain features have to exist if you want things to build and copy themselves reliably.
Fascinating. So we're seeing that information isn't just a result of stuff organizing itself. It's like a necessary ingredient for things to even get going.
Right. But hold on, there's another layer. Information can't just float around, right? It needs a physical form. The book mentions Landauer's principle.
That information is physical.
That's the one. Every bit of information, whether it's in your DNA or on a hard drive, it's represented by something physical. Even erasing information, that costs energy.
So there's no escaping the physical world, even when we're talking about something as abstract as information.
Nope. And that means the way life processes information, it's bound by the laws of physics and chemistry. It's not just manipulating abstract bits, it's working with molecules and energy.
Makes sense.
And here's the cool part. Life uses both digital and analog information. Like your DNA, that's digital, a clear sequence. But then you've got things like protein gradients within a cell, that's analog. It's more like a dimmer switch, right?
So a blend of precision and flexibility.
Exactly. And this duality is everywhere in biology, from cells to ecosystems. Digital provides the blueprint, analog allows for nuance and adaptation.
Like a recipe with room for improvisation.
Perfect analogy. And this leads to this super interesting thought. Maybe by looking at how information works at higher levels, like in societies, we can learn something about how life itself emerged.
So, like, extrapolate back to the origins of it all.
Yeah, the book talks about Eric Krucker's idea that life is basically made of these evolved inferential mechanisms, things that gather information and use it to act within constraints.
So life is constantly learning and adapting based on information and limits.
That's the gist. And here's a curveball. The book also talks about how noise can actually be beneficial in biology.
Noise, like random stuff.
Yeah, it sounds counterintuitive, right? But there's this thing called stochastic resonance.
Stochastic or what now?
It's basically like, imagine a weak signal. You add a bit of noise, and suddenly the signal becomes clear.
Wait, so randomness can actually enhance a message?
In certain systems, yes. The book gives this example of fire ants, how a bit of randomness in their pheromone trails might actually help them find food more efficiently.
So sometimes a little chaos is a good thing. Okay, I'm starting to see a pattern here.
Right. Now, let's talk about this classic division in the study of life, the easy and hard problem.
Ah, yes, the age-old questions.
The easy one being how the physical and chemical stuff gives rise to the features of life we observe, metabolism, reproduction, all that.
And the hard one being consciousness, the subjective experience. That's the real brain bender.
Right. And the book points out that most research has been focused on the easy problem, which makes sense. It's more tangible.
Yeah, you can poke and prod at molecules. Consciousness, not so much.
But maybe by understanding how information arises and acquires meaning, we can start to bridge that gap. Like, how does matter become about something?
That's deep. So are we saying the meaning is somehow encoded in the information?
It's a possibility, right? And this brings up another point. Are we biased by only studying life on Earth? What if alien life is totally different?
Like, what if it's not even carbon-based?
Exactly. The book talks about this bias we might have in astrobiology, assuming alien life would be similar to ours.
Just because we haven't found anything else yet doesn't mean it's not out there.
Exactly. And maybe instead of looking for specific chemicals, we should be looking for the active role of information. Like, that could be a universal signature of life.
That's interesting. So, regardless of the building blocks, it's the way they process information that matters.
Right. And there's this fascinating example in the book, the Craig Venter Institute experiment. They basically took one bacteria and reprogrammed it into another species just by transplanting its genome.
Whoa, so they basically swapped the software.
Pretty much. It shows how powerful the information in DNA is. But hold on, the book also gets into some really mind-bending stuff about the limits of what's even possible in the universe.
Limits, as in, even if something's allowed by the laws of physics, it might not be actually achievable.
Yeah, it's this idea that you can't always get there from here. Like, even if a state is theoretically possible, it might not be reachable because of the specific way our universe started.
So it's not just about the rules, but the starting conditions too.
Right, and time reversal symmetry adds another layer of complexity. It's like not all paths are equally accessible.
Wow, this is getting pretty heavy. So even the laws of physics might not be enough to explain everything.
And here's where things get really speculative. The book mentions this idea of evolving laws. Like, maybe for living systems, maybe the rules aren't fixed.
Evolving laws. You mean like the laws themselves could change over time?
That's the suggestion. Maybe it's a way to explain how complexity emerges despite these limitations.
So is it like the information itself is somehow influencing the laws of physics?
That's the big question, right?
Yeah.
We've got information that's physical, it has causal power, and maybe the rules governing it can change. But there's still a missing piece.
A missing piece.
A complete physical theory of information. Like, we still don't fully understand how information can call the shots in the way we see in life.
So we're missing the link between information and its influence on the physical world.
Exactly. We have information theory, which is great for understanding communication and data, but we need something deeper to explain how information acts in living things.
And maybe, just maybe, this missing piece could also help us crack the code of consciousness.
It's a possibility. The book hints at a potential connection between information theory and the heart problem. Maybe understanding how information acquires meaning is the key.
Okay, so we need a new theory of information.
Yeah.
But the book does mention constructor theory as a possible starting point.
Right. Constructor theory gives us a way to think about information in terms of what's possible and impossible, in terms of tasks.
Right. We talked about that earlier.
And it neatly ties together classical and quantum information. It even suggests that quantum information might be a more fundamental kind of super information.
Super information. So like quantum information is the ultimate boss level.
Kind of. And by focusing on possibilities and impossibilities, constructor theory helps us see how information can be like a base layer of reality.
So it's not just a description, it's baked into how the universe works.
Exactly. And it's especially helpful for understanding self-replication. Constructor theory explains why life is kind of weird from a physics perspective.
Weird how?
Well, living things are like accurate constructors. They do this very specific task, replicating themselves super reliably, and they keep doing it.
Okay, so it's not just any old process. It's got to be precise and repeatable.
And constructor theory says that to do this, any entity needs a modular replicator, which is basically a recipe and a way to correct errors.
Makes sense. You need the instructions and a way to make sure they're followed correctly.
Right. And this idea actually builds on John von Neumann's work on self-replication in, get this, cellular automata.
Cellular automata, those little grid things.
Yeah, it's like he was exploring the logic of self-replication in these simple systems, and constructor theory takes that logic and applies it to the laws of physics.
So it's saying that this logic might be universal, not just one way to do things, but maybe the only way.
That's the suggestion. Now let's circle back to biological information itself. The book highlights this huge amount of information we've discovered in living systems, from their structures to the molecules like DNA and RNA.
It's mind-boggling how much information is packed into even the simplest cell.
Totally. And the book brings up these fundamental questions from Gregory Bateson about information. How is it different from matter and energy? How does it connect to them? And what's its physical basis in terms of thermodynamics?
Bateson's questions are still so relevant. It's easy to take information for granted, but when you really think about it, it's kind of mysterious.
Right. Like, it's not energy itself, but it takes energy to create and use it. The book explores this idea of information being latent in the organization of matter and energy.
So like the arrangement of things holds information.
Exactly. And processes like self-assembly and self-organization, they can generate structure and therefore this latent information.
But self-organization, that needs energy input, right?
You got it. And that brings in the concept of work, a very specific term in physics. Work is key to understanding how life got started and how information emerged.
Work is in directed effort.
Exactly. Life needs this constructive, coordinated work, and it's fueled by differences in free energy.
Like a gradient, right? Something flowing from high to low.
Exactly. And the book dives into how networks of self-organizing chemical reactions can emerge and tap into these energy sources. They talk about autocatalytic sets.
Autocatalytic, like self-powering.
Yeah. It's a set of molecules that basically produce themselves. And the cool thing is, constraints within the system can actually increase free energy, channeling it into these autocatalytic members.
So limitations can actually be beneficial.
In a way, yes, because they focus the energy where it's needed. And this leads to the emergence of function, even a kind of primitive purpose.
Yeah, which are like the hallmarks of life, right?
Totally. Now, these autocells are a step towards life, but they're missing something: replication.
The ability to make copies, that's crucial.
The book argues that replication opens the door to natural selection, and more importantly, to the copying of useful variations.
So now you can have information that actually does something, not just information that is something.
That's the idea. And this copying process, the book argues, is the origin of what we call semantic information, information with meaning.
So meaning emerges from function, from the consequences of using that information.
Exactly. But there's a counter-argument, too, that even in early replicating systems, it might still just be a more complex form of latent information.
So the jury's still out on exactly when meaning kicks in.
Kind of. But even with replication, the road to complex life is bumpy. The book talks about error catastrophe, where if the copying process is too messy, you can't build complex, error-correcting molecules.
So like the information gets corrupted too easily.
Exactly. And then there's the problem of parasitic mutants that just want to copy themselves without contributing anything useful.
Reloaders.
Totally. And these were essentially informational bottlenecks. The book proposes that a key step was decoupling metabolism and reproduction.
Decoupling, meaning separating the process.
Yeah, that led to coded replication, which is like the first instance of truly semantic information. And from there, you get more robust evolution.
So like a more sophisticated operating system that can handle more complexity.
Good analogy. Now let's talk about autonomous agents. These are things that arise from physics and chemistry, but they can act on their own behalf, perform work, and even reproduce using their own internal constraints.
Autonomous agents, huh? Sounds almost like free will.
It's getting into that territory. The book raises questions about what's really required for this kind of agency and what choosing even means in a physical system.
Like, is it true choice or just a series of predetermined actions?
Deep stuff. The book highlights Stuart Kaufman's idea that an autonomous agent needs to be able to extract energy and make choices that benefit its own persistence.
So it's not just reacting to the environment, it's actively pursuing its own goals.
Exactly. And the book gives examples of how even tiny environmental cues can trigger adaptive actions in these agents.
So they're constantly sensing and responding to information.
And in complex systems, you often see this bow tie architecture for information flow, like how DNA goes to RNA, which then makes proteins.
The bow tie, right. So you've got this central bottleneck, the RNA, that translates between the variety in DNA and the functionality of proteins.
Exactly. It's like a balance between flexibility and stability. And remember how we talked about coded replication being a big deal? Well, the book argues that once that happened, evolution could really take off in terms of complexity.
Because the instructions were separated from the day-to-day operations.
Right. Now, hold on. There's a twist. The book also explores alternative ways that molecular information might be stored and transmitted beyond DNA, like dynamic chemical networks.
So, like, DNA isn't the only game in town.
Maybe not. These networks show that there could be other ways to carry and replicate information at the molecular level.
Interesting. But it sounds like they haven't reached the same level of complexity as DNA yet.
That's the challenge. But the book gives examples like self-assembling peptides with autocatalytic properties that show potential.
So it's possible that life elsewhere in the universe might use completely different information systems.
It's a possibility. Now, Dennis Noble comes in with a really important perspective. He questions whether organisms really encode everything digitally in their genes.
So, like, is DNA the be-all and end-all of inheritance?
That's what he challenges. He argues that analog information coming from the cell's structure and dynamics is also vital.
So it's not just the sequence of letters in the DNA, but the physical arrangement of everything, too.
Exactly. He says the non-DNA information in eukaryotic cells with their complex organization is at least as important as the genome itself.
That's a big claim. So, like, the cell's architecture itself is carrying information.
That's the idea. And he points out that cells can divide even without a nucleus, suggesting that key functions evolved before DNA was the main player.
So DNA might not be the original information carrier, just the most sophisticated one we know.
Right. And this challenges the gene-centric view. It makes you wonder how structural information is really encoded in the linear sequence of DNA.
Yeah, it's like, is there some hidden code within the code?
Maybe. And the book even suggests that DNA might not be a complete program for life.
A program? Like, it's missing some lines of code.
It's more like maybe nature uses the inherent physics of self-organization to achieve things without needing every detail spelled out in the genes.
So it's not just the blueprint, but the materials and the environment, too.
Exactly. And think about how species branch off, like Darwin's finches. The book says this might be driven by self-selection and epigenetic changes, not just random mutations.
Epigenetic changes, those are like modifications on top of the DNA, right?
Yeah. And studies of the finches show that these epigenetic changes are just as important as genetic ones in explaining the differences between species.
So it's not just the DNA sequence that evolves, it's the way it's used and controlled.
Exactly. And this leads to the idea that evolution itself might have evolved to become more efficient at finding solutions.
So evolution is getting better at evolving.
It's a wild thought, but the research suggests that organisms often find solutions much faster than you'd expect from random mutations alone.
Like there's some hidden intelligence driving the process.
It's a possibility. Now let's shift gears to artificial life. The book dives into these systems like Avida, where they study information content and self-replication in digital organisms.
Avida, interesting. So like simulated life on a computer.
Exactly. And they define information content in terms of how much a biomolecule reduces entropy or disorder.
So more organization equals more information.
Basically. And in Avida, these self-replicating digital sequences, they rely on being translated into instructions that run on a virtual CPU.
Like they need a virtual brain to execute the code.
Right. And what's cool is even a tiny bias in how these virtual instructions are distributed can make self-replication much more likely to evolve.
So the starting conditions really matter. But does this explain where the first information came from?
Not really. The book points out that evolution in Avida increases information content over time, but it doesn't explain the origin of the very first bits.
So it's still a mystery how that initial spark happened.
Yeah, but it's worth remembering that, in theory, information can arise by chance. given enough time and possibilities.
Like the infinite monkey theorem, right? Eventually they'll type Shakespeare.
Exactly. And even these digital organisms undergo mutations. Studying how well they can self-replicate under different Avitas settings is super insightful.
It's like a controlled experiment for evolution itself.
Totally. Now let's come back to the real world. The book emphasizes this constant struggle for energy that life faces.
Yeah, you gotta eat to live.
Right. And this leads to the view of life as a bunch of evolved inferential mechanisms that rely on memory, which is information and computation, to find energy.
So like efficient foraging algorithms shaped by evolution.
Exactly. And Eric Krakauer takes this further, saying that natural selection concentrates information, which then leads to an unequal distribution of energy in ecosystems.
So the more information you have, the better you can compete for resources.
And the book also talks about how imitation without any limits could actually be bad for evolution.
Bad. How so?
Well, if everyone just copies the best strategy, there's no more innovation. It's like everyone using the same cheat code.
The game gets boring pretty fast.
Exactly. So there needs to be some kind of secrecy or encryption to prevent perfect imitation.
Encryption.
Yeah.
Like in our DNA.
It's an analogy. The book compares it to cryptography, like the idea of a one-time pad, which is basically unbreakable if you do it right.
So nature has its own ways of protecting its secrets.
And here's another twist. The book talks about how randomness in biological sequences might actually be a form of protection.
Wait, so the random stuff in our DNA might actually be useful?
Potentially. It could be a way to prevent other organisms from detecting a signal or exploiting a predictable pattern.
Like camouflage, but for information.
That's a good way to put it. And the book gives this example of the MIC genes in ciliates, which are deliberately randomized, maybe to protect against viruses.
So it's like nature's own antivirus software.
Pretty cool, right? Now let's touch on speciation, the process of new species forming. The book talks about how reduced genetic recombination often defines the boundary between species.
Recombination. That's how genes get shuffled during reproduction, right?
Yep. And it also brings up the C-value paradox, the fact that genome size doesn't always correlate with organism complexity.
So some simple creatures have tons of DNA, while some complex ones have less.
That's the paradox. And it suggests that what we call junk DNA might actually have important regulatory functions.
So the amount of information isn't just about the number of genes, it's about how they're controlled.
Exactly. Now let's talk about cellular automata, or CA. These are simple computational models that can produce amazingly complex behavior from simple rules.
Those grid things, right? I've seen those.
Yep. And the book uses them to illustrate that idea that encryption in biological systems might arise by accident, like a frozen accident that shapes how the system evolves.
Frozen accident. Sounds like a happy little mistake.
Kind of. And it highlights the limits of reductionism. Just knowing the basic rules doesn't always mean you can predict the overall behavior.
It's like the whole is greater than the sum of its parts.
Exactly. And this brings us back to the idea of noise, but this time focusing on how it can be good for biological systems.
Hold on, didn't we just talk about noise as a form of encryption?
We did. But noise can also help a system escape from a suboptimal state or even improve signal detection.
Wait, so noise can make things better?
Sometimes, yes. There's this thing called stochastic resonance, where noise actually amplifies weak signals.
That's crazy. So it's like the noise adds just enough energy to push the signal over the threshold.
Exactly. And the book gives examples of how dithering, which is adding noise to digital signals, can actually preserve information.
Dithering, so like adding a bit of fuzz to smooth things out.
Kind of. And there's evidence for stochastic resonance in real-world systems like the climate system, honeybee communication, even fire ant pheromone trails.
So nature is using noise to its advantage in all sorts of ways.
It seems so. And the book even talks about how noise can be beneficial for learning and development.
So like a little randomness helps the brain figure things out.
It's a possibility. Now let's talk about state-space compression, or SSC.
State-space compression, huh? Sounds technical.
It's basically about finding simpler descriptions of complex systems that still allow for accurate predictions, like finding the right level of detail.
So zooming out to see the big picture without getting lost in the details.
That's a good way to put it. And the book argues that natural selection probably had to solve this SSC problem when designing brains.
Makes sense. Brains have to process a ton of information efficiently.
Right. And human engineered systems do this too, like the branch prediction mechanisms in computer processors.
So it's a universal problem in information processing.
Totally. And the book formalizes SSC, talking about microstates, observables, accuracy, and computational cost. It even connects it to similar ideas in economics and control theory.
So finding efficient descriptions is a problem across many fields.
Exactly. But the book also reminds us that it's hard to reverse engineer complex systems, like figuring out the rules just from observing the behavior.
Yeah, it's easy to get fooled by emergent complexity.
They use this example of cellular automaton rule 30, which generates these crazy complex patterns from simple rules.
It's a good reminder that simple things can produce incredibly complex results.
Now let's talk about natural computation and programmability in biology.
Programmability, like cells are running software.
It's a useful analogy. The book talks about using sensitivity analysis and Lyapunov exponents to understand how biological systems respond to inputs.
So poking the system to see how it reacts.
Exactly. And with all the data we're gathering, we can now study how systems respond to natural perturbations.
Like watching the system's behavior in real time.
Right. And information theory is great for understanding processes like DNA replication. It helps us quantify accuracy and errors.
So we can measure how much information is lost or gained during these processes.
And error correction is key. But remember, those errors can also be the source of new variations for evolution.
So errors can be bad, but also good. It's all about context.
And the book even talks about applying computability and information theory to modify cell behavior, like in cancer research.
So like reprogramming cells by understanding their information processing.
Exactly. The book uses this analogy of cancer being a programming bug.
A bug, like a software glitch.
Yeah. And if we can understand the bug, maybe we can fix it.
That's a powerful idea.
Now, the immune system is a great example of a biological information processing system. It recognizes patterns, communicates, and remembers.
The immune system is incredibly complex.
Wow.
It's like our body's own defense network.
And the book talks about how errors in DNA repair and things like telomere shortening are examples of information loss that can lead to disease and aging.
So it's like the system is losing data over time.
And the book also talks about reprogramming cells, particularly stem cells, to become specific cell types.
So like giving them new instructions to change their fate.
Exactly. And a computational understanding of cancer based on these bug states could lead to new treatment strategies.
So it's about understanding the software of life to cure diseases.
Right. And studying how fast information spreads through a system can help us pinpoint problems. Small changes at lower levels can amplify as they move upwards.
Like a ripple effect.
And the immune system's response, like increasing certain cell types, can be seen as a sign that it's trying to debug a problem.
So it's constantly monitoring and reacting to information.
Now, zooming out even further, the book discusses the challenge of connecting macro-level biological principles to the micro-level stuff.
So like how do you go from molecules to ecosystems?
Exactly. And so far, we haven't been that successful at finding clear connections between macro-level variables and the fundamental laws of physics.
It's like there's a gap between the different levels of description.
And the book talks about how new organizational levels emerge when the individual components rely more on simplified descriptions of their surroundings.
So they're making decisions based on a less detailed picture of the world.
And when their individual estimates align, you get these slow variables that become the defining features of the new level.
It's like a consensus emerges from the collective information processing.
Which leads to this idea of collective computation. Multiple components are doing this coarse graining at the same time.
So the system's behavior emerges from the interactions of all these individual agents.
And the book stresses that it's not enough to just list the strategies. We need to understand how the configurations of those strategies affect the overall output.
It's like, how does the network structure influence the flow of information?
And effective theories for biological systems need to be more than just concise. They need to capture the causal relationships and be computationally efficient.
So they need to be both accurate and manageable.
Right. Now let's talk about downward causation. This is the idea that life can spontaneously generate events, breaking the usual chain of cause and effect.
Downward causation. So like the future influencing the past.
Not quite. It's more like higher levels of organization influencing lower levels.
So the whole constraining the parts.
Exactly. And the book argues that this might be a defining feature of